Angular best practice tip, and in today's tip we're going to talk about improving the ngFor loops by providing a trackBy function. We have the full source code and a step-by-step guide in our site academies.com, course Angular best practices ngFor trackBy. The site is completely free and open source. Step-by-step guide and source code are available in the site. So how does Angular ngFor works during updates? Every change detection cycle, the ngFor will recalculate the changes in the array that it's getting. And based on the calculation of changes, Angular will know if it needs to recreate an item in the list from scratch, or update an item in the list, or destroy an item of the list. Now the thing is, many developers are using ngFor and they are completely recreating the DOM elements when they actually should update those DOM elements. And this causes a major cost on performance, as well as sometimes bug when you need to save the internal state of the DOM element. Let's show by code how we can improve the performance of our ngFor. Let's create a new Angular application, and in that application give an example of a simple ngFor. So I'll open the terminal and I'll npx Angular CLI latest, and I'll create a new project called trackBy demo with a flag of minimal. Angular CLI will probably ask me a few questions. Yes, I want to install Angular CLI. At the time of this recording, we are working with Angular 17. It doesn't important which styling you want. We will choose CSS. We're not going to focus on that. Angular 17 is also asking, as part of the bootstrapping, if you want to include server-side rendering and static site generation. We're not going to focus on that, so choose the default no. And we'll wait a few seconds for Angular CLI to create our project. We opened our new created application using VS Code. Now let's add a simple ngFor. I'm going to open the source, open the app component, and in the app component, I'm going to delete the default welcome to in the title and place a list of users where each user will have an ID and each user will have also a name. We'll have 3 users, and I'm going to place the users in an unordered list where each user will be placed in an LI. So each LI will have an ngFor. This is our simple ngFor. Let user of our users list, and we are going to display the username, but we are going to display that username inside an input. You'll see the reason later on. So we'll place an input type text, and we'll bind the value to be the user.name. Let's save, let's open the terminal, do an ngserve, and check out that our list of users is being displayed. So I'll open my browser and I see that I have 3 inputs with three users. Our simple ngFor is working and printing the users. Now that we have our simple ngFor, let's show an example where we update a user to see the DOM element be updated, and let's also recreate a user to see the DOM element created from scratch. So let's go back to our code and let's add 2 buttons. One button will be update, and the other button will be recreate. And we'll attach a click method to both of those buttons. One we'll call update and one we'll call recreate. We'll create those methods, the update and recreate. Now in the update, we'll grab the first user and we'll simply change the name to, let's say, a new name, and in the recreate we're going to grab the first user and completely replace the object with a new object, let's say ID 1 and name, let's say John Doe. Now let's go back to the browser to examine this code. And I'll start with the button of recreate, and I want to look at the LIs, see what happens when we press the recreate. Have you seen the change of color in the LI? This means that the LI is being recreated. Let's show this again. If I press the recreate, examine the first LI. If I press the recreate, let's close this, and let's examine the first LI. You'll see a blink of color, a change in the UL and a change in the LI, meaning the LI is completely recreated. Now let's press the update. And if I press the update, you don't see the LI changing colors, meaning we just performed an update. What does it mean? The recreate will completely create the first LI from scratch, creating a new li. The recreate will create a new li and replace the existing one. The update will just update that li. So understand that when you're working with ngFor and there is some kind of update to your array, you need to check, you need to know if the item is being recreated from scratch, creating a new DOM element and replacing the old one, or the item is being updated. Let's try to understand the default behavior of ngFor. How did ngFor knew that it needs to update the DOM element, and how did ngFor knew that it needs to completely recreate the DOM element? We saw an example where ngFor, in this case, when we just changed the name, ngFor knew that it needs to update the li. Well, in the second case, when we completely replace the object in index 0, then ngFor knew that it needs to destroy the existing DOM element li and recreate a brand new DOM element li. And understanding when those DOM elements are recreated will mean that we improve the performance of our ngFor loops. So we need to understand the default behavior of ngFor. Now, ngFor is tracking the changes in the array that we provide. So if we provide the ngFor an array of users, that ngFor, every change detection, will track the changes in this array using something called iterable differs. We're not going to cover iterable differs in this lesson, but basically the default behavior is just using strict equality between the array items. So what Angular will do in every change detection, it will compare strict equality with the array after the change. So in this case, the object is strict equal to the same object in the previous change detection cycle. So Angular knows that there is no change in the first element. So Angular will just update and not recreate. In the second element, because we're passing a brand new object, it's not strict equal to that object in the previous change detection cycle. So Angular completely recreate that DOM element. So Angular uses strict equality. So in the following case, Angular will not, the strict equal will be equal to previous iteration. So in this case, Angular will update the DOM element and not recreate. So Angular uses strict equality every change detection cycle to understand if it needs to update the DOM element or completely recreate that DOM element. So here's a common mistake that many Angular developers are doing with their ngFor. We often don't even realize it, but we are completely replacing the array in the ngFor with a brand new array with brand new objects, which causes the ngFor to completely recreate the DOM elements in the list, which costs us performance-wise. I often see the case when we use ngFor to display an array that we're grabbing from a server. In that case, we're using, for example, HTTP client. We are sending a request, we are getting an array of data, and then we display that array. If we send another request and we update the array, then the elements, the DOM elements, are completely recreated. Let's say a scenario of a list that displays with a search. You have a search and then a list of items. Every time you type in the search input, the list is filled. You send a request to a server and the server returns you a new list. In this case, every time you send a request, you get a brand new list. All the DOM elements are completely recreated, where some elements might need to be replaced and not recreated. So I see that mistake a lot, and many times when you use ngFor to display an array from a server, I see that mistake that Angular developers are not realizing that when they completely replace the array and the object of the array, they completely recreate the DOM elements list in places where they often need to update items in the list. Let's show an example of the common mistake that we talked about. Let's give an example where our list that we give to the ngFor is completely replaced with a brand new list. Like when we're doing a server query and we'll get a brand new list, we'll completely replace the users list. And let's see what happens to the DOM elements. So let's go back to our code, and I'll add another button which we'll call fetch, which we will imagine like it's doing a server call. But in fact, what it's going to do, we're simply going to replace the array with a brand new identical array. So the fetch method will do a complete replacement of the existing users array. So what it's going to do is going to grab the users and it's going to map where each element of the user will be a clone of the existing element. So basically we're creating identical array with identical objects, only everything is new. Every object in the array are new. And let's see what happens when we click the fetch. We'll examine the LIs and we'll click the fetch and we see that the colors here change, signifies that all the UL and the LIs are completely recreated to basically display the same data again. So it's very ineffective. And it will be especially felt when you have big arrays that you pass to the ngFor. So let's see how we can remedy this ineffective behavior using a trackBy function in our ngFor. To optimize the performance of our ngFor and specify in our ngFor when we want the DOM elements to be updated and when we want them to be recreated, we can pass additional input to the ngFor, a trackBy function. TrackBy is an additional input to the ngFor that allows us to override the default strict equality of comparing object and using strict equality to decide if an element in the array is changed or not. Using trackBy, we can pass a function and customize when we want DOM elements to be updated. So basically, the trackBy, we pass a function to the trackBy, and Angular uses the trackBy function every change detection cycle with their iterable differs to decide with the function that we give how the array changed. So in this case, we can grab the ngFor, pass a trackBy function called user_id. The trackBy function gets as first argument the index of the array that is now being examined, as well as the item in the array. In our case, we named it user. And in our case, we can return that the items in the array will be compared using the user_id, which is very popular when you get object from a server with primary key of ID. You usually want to pass a trackBy function returning that item primary key. So in our case, if we go back to our code, we can see that we can pass in our ngFor, we can pass a trackBy function, and we can say we can want those items in the list to be compared by, let's say, a function called user_id, trackBy user_id. Now let's create this function. The first element of the trackBy function is the index that is now being checked. The second element is the actual item in the list that is being checked. And we're going to return the user_id. Now let's say that the index is a number and the user is type of this user's at place 0. Okay, but basically it's an object here. So we are placing a trackBy function. Now let's go back to our browser and let's hit the fetch again and see what happens. So let's see our DOM elements, if they're created or not. We see that our DOM elements are now not created and the colors did not change. Let's go back to our code and let's remove for a second the trackBy function. Let's go back to our browser now. The fetch will recreate the DOM elements like we saw, but let's see what happens. Another bug that someone asked me why it happens in their ngFor, and that was the solution to that bug. He changed something. For example, we changed something in the input, and then we click the fetch, but the item is restored. The DOM element loses its state. So it's not only cost us in terms of performance, it also costs us in terms of bugs if we need to save state in the DOM elements. But the trackBy functions allow us to customize the behavior and not compare with strict equality the items of the array, but compare with a certain element. In our case, we compare using an ID, which causes our list to not be recreated, but to be updated. Our performance is better, and we have less bugs in terms of preserving the state in the DOM elements. If you're more on the strict nature, and I saw some organization that use this rule, you can enforce trackBy in all your ngFor. Then if you're interested in the ngFor default strict equality comparison, you still can provide a trackBy function which simply returns the second argument, returns the object, and then you'll get the Angular ngFor default behavior. So I saw organization and Angular developers that prefer to be strict and force that trackBy will always be supplied with their ngFor. And you can do it with a lint rule. You can add a lint rule that will enforce that all your ngFor have a trackBy function. The lint rule is called Angular ESLint template use trackBy function. Let's take this lint rule and let's add lint to our app. So we'll do npx ng lint. So do I want to install the lint? Yes. And Angular will create a file called eslint.rc, and I can update that file and add rules to that file. And one of those rules are the Angular ESLint template use trackBy function. So let's copy this rule and go back to our code and wait for a few seconds and modify the eslint.rc file, and then in the rules section at the bottom add that we want the Angular ESLint template use trackBy, and I want it to display an error if it's not provided. Now if I go back to my component and I don't provide a trackBy function, and so in this case let's do npx ngLint to have a lint test. So I got an error missing trackBy function, and if I restore the trackBy function and do another time ngLint, then my lint are passing. And make sure that your lint is running with your CI, so you can enforce the trackBy by using a lint rule. So to summarize this lesson where we improve the performance of our ngFor, in every use of ngFor, you have to ask yourself, when do you want the DOM elements that are created by ngFor? When do you want those DOM elements to be updated? And when do you want those DOM elements to be created? Based on that answer, supply a trackBy function. In many cases, the trackBy function will return the object primary key, like we saw in our example where we return the user ID. If you keep that in mind and you use the developer tools to understand which DOM elements your ngFor is creating and updating and optimizing this behavior, you will massively improve the performance of your entire Angular application. As usual, we have all the source code in our site, academies.com, course Angular, best practices, ngFor trackBy. You have the source code, the video, and a step-by-step guide to everything we talked about in this lesson. Thank you very much. Let's jump into the next lesson.